Okay, 11 now. Shall we start? Right. Okay. Good afternoons for those in the US, and good night for those in the Asia. Welcome to another virtual seminar of AREUEA. Today's we are pleased to have James Graham from University of Sydney together, who is going to present this interesting paper, Public Education and Intergenerational Housing Effects. I think I'm not sure your co-author is in the session, but this is a joint work with Mike Girain and also Angela Cheng. So again, just some housekeeping. We're going to have 60 minutes for presentation, followed by a Q&A session. If we also have this chat function here, if you'd like to ask questions or to clarification question, you can actually post your question on the chat room, or you can unmute yourself and ask a question directly to James. Right. Without further ado, James, the floor is you.
Great, thank you. Thanks everyone for attending. So I might be the earliest morning person here. It's 2 a.m. for me. So if I fall asleep, that's my fault, not yours. Yeah, great. Thank you all for having me. So this is our paper with Mike and Angela, and I think I'll just jump right in. But yeah, please do ask questions as we go. I'm happy to field them and stop as we're going along. So the idea for this paper is to try and think about housing wealth effects in a very broad sense. So we already know from a very, very long literature at this point that house price fluctuations can have these large wealth effects on existing homeowners. So as house prices go up, people, they feel wealthier, they want to consume out of that wealth, and they may go out and spend in order to do so. That's a very well-known kind of set of facts out there in the housing and macro literature. But if we think about housing wealth effects more broadly, first, we're starting to see some papers, very recent papers, talking about wealth effects on younger generations, as in parents maybe passing wealth down to their children, either directly through transfers or, maybe through a bequest later on in life. And secondly, people have started to think about how housing and housing wealth is tied to the location in which that house resides. So you can think about things like local labor markets or local schools as being tied to the houses, and that's going to influence wealth and wealth accumulation decisions as well. So we want to think about the paper. We want to think about housing wealth effects in that context, and in particular through this intergenerational wealth effect lens. And so our main mechanism we're going to study here is how changes in local house prices may influence local schools, and in particular local school quality. And as local school quality is adjusting or changing, this can lead to faster human capital accumulation and therefore better outcomes for children in the future. So you're going from a price effect through a kind of local equilibrium effect into child outcomes. And so this has big implications for intergenerational inequality and also intergenerational mobility, but we want to link it to this idea that really it's a housing wealth effect. So rather than just a direct, your housing value goes up and you consume, it's really housing value goes up and that's influencing other types of wealth accumulation like human capital accumulation. And so that's what we're going to be talking about here. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of our results and where things are still a little bit work in progress, and then I'll dive right in. So we're going to start by presenting a kind of toy model just to give you the idea about how these housing wealth effects might take place and what the kind of trade-offs are for people thinking about their housing wealth. We'll then present some empirical analysis of the main mechanism here, which is that as house prices move, local school quality adjusts along with it. And then finally, we'll turn back to a model again, and we'll use a quantitative spatial overlapping generations model to again go back to these housing wealth effects and be able to say something quantitative about their size. So in that illustrative toy model, I'll show you this in a couple of minutes, we're going to have parents that make simple decisions about the neighborhoods that they want to live in, and then the amount of education they want to provide to their children. And here we'll just assume exogenously that local house prices are tied to school quality. So there's no equilibrium here. We'll just assume that when prices go up, school quality goes up along with it. And in that case, we're going to see that child incomes will increase as well. But parents who are making this decision about where to live now face this trade-off. They can either, so they'll see their neighborhood price go up, they could sell that house and move to another neighborhood and thereby consume some of this housing equity gain. Or they could stay in the neighborhood that they're currently living in, and then their children will get the benefit of this rising school quality. So we're going to talk a bit about that trade-off and how it influences these wealth effects.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead.
I would say that the direction goes from local school quality to house prices and not in reverse. If school quality goes up, right, that people are going to be willing to pay more for that, and prices go up. So house prices in and of themselves don't necessarily lead to increases in school quality. I mean, I guess the argument is that then richer people live in, and then they have higher demand for school quality, and they vote to, raise taxes and spend more on schools. But I think the primary direction is the other way.
Sure. No, I don't disagree on that. There's definitely a direction, the other direction. So there's a really long literature, I think, starting with Sandra Black, talking about, like school boundaries, where we get higher school quality on one side of the boundary versus another. And you do see big differences in prices there. Most of that analysis is kind of static or steady state, though. There's not a lot that comes from dynamic changes in school quality. There's a few papers about changes in rules for schools that can do this. So you do see things go that way. We're going to focus on this other channel, though, so that we can tie things to a housing wealth effects story. But you're right. But you're absolutely right. Things do go the other direction too. I don't disagree with that. Primarily,
I would say, not just two, but primarily.
Yeah, that's a fair point. That I don't know how to answer. It's hard to know how we would show. It's hard to know how we would show that it's the one effect is larger than the other. I don't know how we would do that. But here, what I am going to be able to show you is that. So first, we think there's a causal channel from prices to school quality. We're going to talk a little bit about what we think the mechanism is. We think it's teacher quality. But we can also show that these neighborhoods are changing in response to these to these house price shocks. So we know there's going to be, migration and changes in composition, and we think that's what's driving the school quality changes. Yeah, I'm not sure how I would answer the question about which is larger. I don't even really know how I'd get at it, but it's a good point. I don't know. I think there's one other hand up as well.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, hi. My name is Maggie Jacobson. I'm at the Federal Reserve Board, and I had a similar question, and I guess maybe you're going to explain this, but house price changes relative to what? Because if I think about the Sun Belt that had these huge house price changes and typically large house price growth, you don't move to the Sun Belt for the great schools. Arizona has some of the lowest public teacher salaries in the U.S., but it has some of the highest house price growth. And on the flip side, if you think of the Rust Belt, some of the suburbs have these amazing school districts that are great school quality, but then never really have house price growth. So
that's a good question. So here, everything we're going to talk about is going to be very local. So we're thinking within a school district. So it's closer to a city. So within a city, where are you moving within a city? And the house price changes are relative to other school zones within that school district. So you're right. This is not a story about like leaving California to move to the Rust Belt or the Sun Belt. This is about within California, moving across San Francisco or something like that.
Or I guess Shaker Heights relative to Cleveland, for example.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Exactly. Something more like that. Yeah, that's a good question too. Yeah, so I'll talk about that now. So in our empirical analysis, then we want to provide some evidence that this mechanism looks like it's there. And going back to Jeff's point, I can't tell you how big this looks relative to the other direction, but we're going to say from house prices to school quality. So we'll use local house price data. And this is going to come from the Zillow real estate company. You probably know that data set a little bit. And then we'll use an administrative data set on students, schools, and academic performance for a particular large school district. And with that data, we can compute measures of school quality. We'll just use a standard kind of value-added computation. And then what we'll do is we'll show that school zones with faster house price growth look like they have larger improvements in school quality. I'll talk more about how we identify everything there when I get to that section, but we'll use some instruments. But the main takeaway from this is that with the back of the envelope calculation, we find that around a 1 standard deviation increase in house prices is associated with around a $50,000 increase in the present value of lifetime income for children in those school zones. So this is not small. When you see these movements in house prices, you do see these big changes in quality, and it looks like it's associated with fairly large increases in lifetime income. So that's going to be our main finding there.
Yeah, Jane, just a quick clarification question. Is your
Yes.
school quality measured by the academic performance of the student, or is there
Yeah.
other way?
No, that's right. So it's using, we use the test scores of the students, so standardized test scores of the students. And we compute, there's like in the education literature, a well-known thing called value added measures. So you're sort of asking how much did a school add to that child's achievement? And so what it's basically doing is controlling for the sorting mechanism. So we're wiping out the fact that some schools just have lots of like gifted children in the first place. And we're saying, well, at those gifted schools, how much does that school add to those gifted children? That's the measure we're using as school quality. Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
You know, I think there's one more hand up as well.
Yeah, I had a question on that. So are you concerned that as house prices are rising, that's indicative of higher income people are moving to the neighborhood and they can afford SAT tutoring?
Oh, I don't know about that specific channel. That's a good point. But we do think that's what's happening. We do think it's, as prices are rising, different people are moving in. So it is changing the school body. It's changing the types of students that are in these areas. But we've also, and I'll show you this too, we've also got evidence that it's changing the teachers themselves. So we do see big changes in the teacher flows and the quality of teachers that's moving across these boundaries as well. So we think it's both. I hadn't thought about the SAT stuff though.
That's an interesting point, because again, I was a little bit kind of thinking of quality. Again, a lot of your Rust Belt cities, you know, they kind of have these entrenched quality, and when you ask people about their housing preferences, it's like we think of schools having reputations, right? So I was kind of curious on, you know, how much actual qualities, but I guess what you're saying, kind of changing the composition of the neighborhood and the locality could have this effect on observable test scores.
Yeah, and I should say too, I'll get to this when I get to the empirical section. This is not something we think is happening like year to year either. This is like over longer horizons, so more like 5 years plus. Yeah, so it's not just like an in and out kind of story. It's more of a long-term thing, but I'll say more about that soon. Okay, so then finally, we then come back to a modeling setup, and we're going to use this quantitative overlapping generations model. So here we've just got a bit more kind of richness to the choices that the households are making. There's now a dynamic neighborhood choice. I'll talk more about that when we get there. There's education choices for the children, and parents can make some transfers to their kids as well. Now we're going to endogenize the school quality mechanism. So house prices need to clear local housing markets, and there'll be a school quality function that we've sort of, I won't say made it up, but we're assuming that it's a function of local income in the neighborhood. And so school quality will also be endogenously determined by who lives in a particular neighborhood. And then with that model in hand, we're then going to run some model experiments where we can try and tease out these housing wealth effects. So the way we do that is we shock a neighborhood with like a local amenities shock. And we treat that as, well, it will be exogenous in the model. So think of building a new park or a new hospital in a particular neighborhood. That will lead to some changes in demand for that neighborhood, and therefore changes in sorting across neighborhoods. That then leads to changes in both house prices and school quality. And so with those two changes, we can then study how households respond, both in terms of their I'm going to call this like a contemporaneous wealth effect. So how much do they want to consume themselves right now? But also intergenerational wealth effects, because these changes in school quality will pass down to the children. And that's what we'll be studying there. Now, I will say up front, this part's still work in progress, and this is probably the most finicky part of the whole paper. If anyone's ever worked with like spatial equilibrium models before, you probably know how delicate these can be. So I would gladly take any suggestions for things we can do once we get to that part of the paper. So I'll look out for your comments. I won't say a huge amount about the literature review. We can sort of talk about that later. There's a massive literature on housing wealth effects, obviously. There's a small and growing literature on intergenerational wealth effects of housing. And then there's kind of this other sort of side literature I think is quite interesting about treating location as an asset itself. And that's kind of how we're thinking of this model, where the location embeds the school quality, and that's part of the wealth that you get by living in a particular location. And then modeling wise, we're building on a very long literature going back to the 90s, using these kind of neighborhood sorting, neighborhood choice, and local education amenities papers. So there are long literature there as well.
Hi, James.
Hi.
Hi, sorry. Can I ask a question? This
Yeah,
is Eva from AUS. Yeah, so for the school quality, do you measure them in the physical capital or human capital? Because if physical capital, the neighborhood can change that, rich people move in and then invest more in the local schools. But for human capital, if better teacher move in, it's more dependent on the government level allocation, which is difficult to be affected.
Yep, that's a really good question. So the quality measure itself is literally just value added. So it's just coming straight from the test scores. When we look at like some of the plausible mechanisms, we're going to tease apart what we'll call, well, a couple of things. We'll tease apart what we call the peer effect, which is just like the student body. We'll tease apart the non-peer effect. That's just everything about the school. And in that school, that will include the teachers, the physical capital of the buildings, the administration of the school culture, and everything like that. And then finally, one more step, we can also pull out the teacher-specific component. And what we find is that the teacher-specific component is by far the largest component, although we probably think some of these other features matter as well, like the physical capital you're talking about. One thing to address this concern about different funding levels, everything we're going to do in the data is within a school district. So within a school district, things like local taxes, local tax revenue are actually distributed evenly. There's no like differences in how much tax revenue is coming to that to a school within the school district. And on top of that, within a school district, the teacher pay levels are also actually the same. So the teachers can't like get more pay by moving to another school, but staying within the district. So that kind of rules out some of these other issues. I can't rule out those things, like you said, I can't rule out, let's say the state government steps in and says we're going to build a new building for, you know, this little school here, but not that school there. We don't have data on that, unfortunately. Yeah, but it's a good question.
And also for the teachers' movement, there is no obstacle for the mobility of the teachers.
Say that one more time. There's no.
For instance, they sign a contract for 2 years or 3 years, and they cannot move.
That's a good question, and yeah, and there's things like tenure and stuff for teachers as well. That's true. We don't have any good data on that either, unfortunately. One thing we can say though is we know what the turnover rate is, and it is quite high. So over like a 5-year period, the turnover rate is something like 20 to 30% of teachers will leave a given school on average. So yeah, I don't know what the actual barriers are to moving, but and yet teachers do move. So yeah, that's really all I have to say about that part. Thank you. Yeah, thanks though. Cool. Was there one more question before I move on?
Better teachers requires more funding, right? So teachers aren't just going to go to schools just because, right? They need to get paid more. So there has to be an increase in school funding, and you should be able to see that in kind of per pupil expenditures. I mean, you can't just expect good teachers to come without there being increases in funding, and that funding has to be, you know, somehow determined by the residents or some sense that they're actually want to increase funding on schools.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I do agree with that. So our previous paper, I'm just going to point it out here, Jing et al. 2021, we looked at that across school districts. So across school districts, there's big differences in per pupil funding, and you can get data on that. We couldn't find data on per pupil funding within this the particular school district we have, or even within other school districts. So I'm not able to look at that. But the other point about teachers not moving unless they get paid more, we don't have direct evidence on this, but we have survey evidence on this from some other papers. And it looks like teachers are willing to move for non-pay reasons if it's associated with things like conditions. And a lot of teachers, for various reasons, feel like they want to teach higher economic status students, and they will move for that reason. So we think that's why they're moving, like within a school district, but without getting a change in pay. So we think that's what's happening. But unfortunately, we can't like directly see that. We can't see the funding of these schools and so on.
Per pupil expenditures for the school districts.
Right, for the whole district, but we're looking within a district. So we can't, what we couldn't find was per pupil expenditures like for an individual school within that district. But if you happen to know.
You can get that in Massachusetts, but you should still see overall per pupil expenditures going up, even at the district level, if you believe that.
Oh no, we can look at that. We certainly can. But as I said, all of the data we're looking at is within the district. So we're saying, like, let's look at different school zones within the same district. I can't see whether that school zone has per pupil funding going up or not, because I just don't have that data.
And it does exist for some states.
It may, yeah. I'm not allowed to say what state it is, but it's a little bit further west of Massachusetts, if that helps you.
Most states are further west of Massachusetts.
yeah. You might be able to guess anyway once we get to the data part. So yeah, we can talk about that a little bit more once we get to the data section. So I'll just briefly cover this kind of toy model to sort of fix ideas about these housing wealth effects. So this is going to be a static decision problem of parents with young children. They'll have some wealth that they enter a period with. They'll own a house in a particular neighborhood. We won't say how they got that house. We'll just say that they have one. They'll choose a new neighborhood to live in. It could be the same neighborhood, but we'll allow them to choose a new neighborhood. They'll consume for themselves. They'll spend on educational goods for their children, and they may leave some transfers to their child. Children's human capital will come from the educational spending and the quality of the local school. And we'll assume that the quality of the local school is just a fixed function of house prices in that location. This is just exogenous for now. We're not going to endogenize it quite yet. So this Q function will be an increasing function of local prices. And then finally, the parents have preferences over over their own consumption and over their children's total wealth. And we'll define total wealth as their, let's say, their lifetime income, YK, plus any transfers that you leave to them. The decision's set up kind of simple. So we say first, conditional on having chosen a particular neighborhood to live in, how much do you consume, educate your child, and give them transfers? And then in the second stage, we decide which neighborhood to live in. So this is what it kind of looks like, super simple. We have a simple value function conditional on your current wealth and your current neighborhood. And then this is if you were choosing a new neighborhood in prime, then this is what you would do. So you would consume, choose some educational expenditures, and leave a bequest. Here's the utility function with this little altruism parameter over your child's utility. Budget constraints straightforward, but I just want to point out these two colored pieces here. So on the right here, this red colored piece, this is you can think of this as the housing equity that you would extract from your current house if you sell your current house and move to another neighborhood. Now, of course, you may move up or move down, in which case it's either equity extraction or equity investment, but you can only get that if you actually leave. On the other hand, house prices in your current neighborhood show up in the school quality function. Now, remember, I'm taking this for given at the moment, but we're assuming that as prices go up, school quality goes up. So the higher priced your neighborhood, the higher is the local school quality, and this is going to influence your child's human capital, which is something you care about for altruistic reasons. So these are the two places where house prices are going to matter for housing wealth effects for these households. So if we take first order conditions for this very, very simple model, here's your consumption function, here's your child's human capital function, and here's your bequests that you leave to your children. And notice again how house prices enter these functions. So in red, we've got this housing equity extraction component. And so it says that if you've got lots of housing equity to be extracted, that's going to tend to increase your consumption, and it will tend to increase the bequests that you leave to your children. But on the other hand, if local school quality is super high because of high house prices, then that will also tend to increase your own consumption. It will certainly increase your child's human capital, but it will tend to decrease the bequest you leave to your children because you're trading off now the income that you're leaving to them versus the transfer that you're leaving to them. So given these first order conditions, these optimal functions, we can now talk about housing wealth effects. So what happens when the current neighborhood that you live in, what happens when that house price starts to rise? And so let's first think about households who are moving. They're going to leave their current neighborhood. So these households are selling their current house and moving to a new neighborhood. If their current house value is going up, that's like a pure wealth effect. They're going to consume more out of this. So the derivative for consumption is positive, but they'll also leave more bequests. So they'll say, well, I've got more money. I can both eat some of it myself and leave some more of it to my children. In this simple model, there'll be no influence on child human capital outcomes because that's not a direct input here, or it's offset the way that the education function's set up. But let's contrast that with a household who's staying in their current neighborhood. So they're not selling, so there's no equity extraction channel here. The only way in which house prices affect them is through the school quality channel. So as school quality is rising because of house prices rising, we'll get a little bit of a boost to consumption. We'll get a big boost to your child's income or their human capital, and we'll get a bit of a decrease to transfers. So what's happening is, as your child's human capital is going up, your child is going to be wealthier in the future. So the parent substitutes by reducing its transfers to the child, and it can say, because it's saved some money by not transferring as much, it can consume that instead. Now notice, if you don't believe my channel, if you think that the school quality channel is just a zero, that derivative is zero, then there's no effects here. And we're back to the world that Bueta talked about in 2010, where he said, oh, well, housing wealth isn't really wealth. Because for people who stay in their house, they're not selling, there's no equity extraction, and so there's no story here. So he says there's no housing wealth channel when you have to just keep living in the house that you're in. And so we're nesting that case here. We're saying if the school quality channel is not operative, then you don't have any housing wealth effects for stayers. It's only because of the school quality channel that you have any effect on stayers. So you can see now, if we go back and forth between these, for movers versus stayers, now households face this trade-off. Do they want to move and eat some of the equity out of their house, or do they want to stay and leave behind some of the school quality to their children in the form of higher human capital?
James,
So oh yes.
why are you ruling out cash-out refis or HELOCs, cap equity without moving?
Only because this is a super simple model, and I'm not going to model that. In the quantitative model, I will allow for mortgages, so people can borrow. So it's not like a cash out refi, but it is. If they already own the house and the house goes up in value, they could borrow more against it. So yeah, I do actually allow for that in the quantitative model, just not here. Yeah, it won't be a big story though, but yeah.
James, I just missed one thing with regards to their choice of other locations.
Yeah.
Is there nothing more convex where if I have an increase in wealth for whatever reason, I can choose to move to a slightly less nice neighborhood and still?
Yeah.
So why is DYK, DP, and 0 if I move?
Because here I'm doing the partial equilibrium effect of just the change in the price of your current neighborhood. So here, when someone moves, it's the change in the previous house value, but with fixing the value of all the other houses. So
yeah, no,
yes,
I get that. But so if my house goes up by $1 million and I don't want to stay in the neighborhood I'm in, I can still move to another reasonably nice neighborhood.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, good point. Okay, so the experiment here is this is holding all else constant. So I'm saying, suppose there's two neighborhoods. And the other neighborhood has not changed in quality, and conditional on the fact that you would have moved to this neighborhood anyway, then the change in price in my original neighborhood has no effect on your human capital. So if I go back to here, so here's your human capital function. If I was already moving to neighborhood 3, let's say, then by changing the price of neighborhood 2, I have no effect on the outcomes from neighborhood 3. That's what I'm saying.
I don't know what already moving means, but sure. I'm just saying if $1 million check lands on my door, but I don't feel like staying in my current neighborhood, I can move to a neighborhood that's nice. So yes,
let me get to that now. So there's the second part of this is how do I change my actual likelihood of moving? And maybe that's kind of what you're getting at here. So you shock my neighborhood. Maybe now I'm more or less likely to move as a result. So that'll come in now. So we're going to set up the decision part about where you live as just a standard discrete choice problem. So we're going to have, let's just keep it simple and have two neighborhoods. You'll receive these preference shocks over your neighborhoods with the standard extreme value assumption. And then we can write down the probability of choosing a neighborhood in closed form. And so it'll look like this. And without getting into too much notation, or at least not describing the notation to you, all I want to show you is what happens to the likelihood of moving given a change in house prices. And the main thing is that this Q function shows up once more. And interestingly, it enters with a negative sign here. So what we're finding is that when house prices go up and your school quality goes up with it, you're now less likely to move out of your current neighborhood because you want to stay and take advantage of your current neighborhood values. Overall, though, you're actually more likely to want to leave precisely because of the housing equity channel. So that's the one you were just talking about. So your house went up $1 million, you get that extra $1 million, that tempts you to sell up and move. So overall, you'll tend to want to move, but the school quality channel will hold you back somewhat. And so we can sort of just graphically represent this like this. This is the change in the probability of moving conditional on a change in house prices. When we have constant school quality or school quality is not responsive to house prices, then everything is housing equity, is a housing equity story. Your price goes up, you want to consume some of that, so you'll leave your current neighborhood, move to a cheaper neighborhood, and you'll be tempted to move. But as soon as school quality moves along with the house prices, now you're less likely to move. That's the red line here, precisely because you want to stay behind to take advantage of the higher school quality. And there's also a little bit of an inequality story here too, just because of declining marginal utility. The lowest income or the lowest wealth households, they're the ones that are going to most want to take advantage of the housing equity channel to sell up and leave. Whereas the wealthier parents are the ones who are more likely to want to stay because they already have a lot of consumption for themselves. They're the ones that are more likely to want to stay and take advantage of the school quality channel. And so that's what we're finding here. So we can characterize those housing wealth effects in more detail, but I think you've got the full story. But if there's questions, Tien, I think you have one.
Oh no, just quick clarification. Do you control for the age of the household?
In the model, the model's like super basic. It's just there's parents making one-time decisions and that's it. In the quantitative model, I'll build in a little bit more life cycle structure, but it's not going to be like I'm not going to model like every age. I'm just going to model some blocks of ages, as you'll see soon.
Okay.
Sure. I think there's one more question too.
Yeah. Do you control for in the quantitative model, like the locality, whether you're rural or suburban? Because I would imagine if you're in a suburb, you can move and keep your same job and your social network. But if you're in a rural locale, like, right, that might influence.
Yeah. That's a good point. So this is, I don't know how familiar you are with kind of like the macro style, like location choice models. We tend to sort of aggregate quite a lot. And so in our quantitative model, we're just going to have 3 neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods kind of like represent certain types of neighborhoods, and they're just going to be sorted on house prices. So we've kind of got like the lowest house price neighborhoods, the middle house price neighborhoods, and the high house price neighborhoods. So we haven't done more about whether these are urban or rural. I can tell you that for the data that we have, that's not going to be a problem, and you might figure that out why in a second. So I'll talk about that now, and maybe that'll help answer why we're not super concerned about urban versus rural. So so let me talk about the empirical analysis now. So here what we're trying to do is we just want to quantify this channel about what's the effect of a change in house prices on school quality. So the data we'll use, and this is where you can use your imaginations to guess where where on the map I'm talking about. So this is school quality data from a large US school district. The school district has around 700,000 students, and we have data on 420 elementary schools. And this is, again, one more time, within a district, these are schools in different zones within that district. So the district is held constant, it's just zones within the district. So what we see is student and parent demographics, and we can track these students and their teachers through time. And using their standardized English and mathematics test scores, we can compute this measure of school value added. So essentially what we do is we just regress out all of the pre-existing factors that would try and explain the test scores of the current students. And then we look at how much is unexplained, and this is basically the value added measure. We then link that to house price data from Zillow. So this is the individual transactions level data from the ZTrax database. You may know, unfortunately, this has been cancelled recently, so you can't use this anymore. So it's probably our last project with this. But with it, we're able to look at house transactions, and we can link these houses to particular school zones. And this is kind of important because there's not very good public data on school zone level, like average house prices. Super easy to get like zip code, sometimes census tract and so on, but harder to form a school zone level price index. So then we compute these median house prices, and then we're also going to build an instrument for house prices using that same data, and I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. So just super high level, first pass version of what's going on here. This is a plot of the 5-year changes in house prices against 5-year changes in school value added. So you can see before I do anything fancy, this is just some fixed effects to wipe out averages across zones. Before I do anything fancy, you can see that as house prices increase, school quality is also increasing with it. Now, this is not causal. There's no identification here. This is just straight from the raw data, essentially. So we want to do this more formally. So we're going to run a simple regression that looks like this. We'll say, what is the effect of a change in house prices over a 5-year period on school value added over the following 5-year period? Now, there's some assumptions embedded in this about timing. So first, why 5-year periods? Partly because we don't think this is a short-term phenomenon. This is not going to be like quarterly changes in prices suddenly change school quality. This is going to be more like a medium to long-run phenomenon. And second, yes, sorry, was there a question? No? Okay. So yeah, and secondly, we'll assume that this is prices change and then school quality changes. And the reason for this is we think that as prices change, that's going to slowly adjust the composition of the local neighborhood, and that's what feeds through into school quality. So again, we don't think this is a fast process. It's much more likely to be a slower process, so we run the regressions this way. I can show you some robustness checks on these timing assumptions, but that'll come a little bit later. We'll include fixed effects at the school zone level and at the time or year level, and we'll also include some demographic controls from the ACS. Having done all that, though, we might still be worried about biases in our estimates of beta. So in particular, we might think that there's measurement error in school zone level house prices because these are pretty small, right? There's not that many house price transactions in a given zone in a given year. So there's certainly measurement error in prices. That's going to definitely bias our estimates of beta downwards. And secondly, there might be endogeneity. So a simple story might be something like environmental factors. So imagine, like removing lead from the water supply. Well, that's going to tend to increase demand for housing, and so prices go up, but it also directly impacts school quality because now the children are not exposed to lead. So there's things like this that are going to tend to cause endogeneity problems. So what we do to address this is we use this instrumental variables strategy from one of my previous papers, which is a Bartik or a shift share style instrument for house prices. And the way we construct this is we take the local shares of particular house characteristics, like number of bedrooms, number of bathrooms, the age of the house, and so on. And we interact those local shares with aggregate changes in the marginal prices of those characteristics. So let's say, for example, you've got one school zone that has lots of one-bedroom houses, but nationally or within the state, one-bedroom houses are suddenly very, very popular. And so demand for one-bedroom houses everywhere is going up. That's going to tend to increase the value of this one little school zone that has lots of one-bedroom houses relative to other school zones that do not have the same set of houses. So that's the way the instrument's going to work. Now, identification is going to follow Goldsmith, Pinkham, Sorokin, and others, where they talk about how you need these shares in the Bartik instrument to be exogenous from the other things that might be affecting your regression. And so we think that's plausible because local housing characteristics just don't change very, very quickly. In our previous paper, we showed the 15-year correlation between housing characteristics 15 years ago and today is something like 0.95. So there's not enough building quickly enough in any given location to really change the composition very fast. So we think this is kind of a plausible strategy here. I will say one more thing just to advertise this instrument. So the reason we're using this and we're not using something, for example, like the Sayers instrument or, the McKay, Gurin, et al. Instrument and so on, is lots of those instruments are at predetermined levels of geography. So the Sayers instrument, for example, is at the MSA level, and you just can't get it down to a finer level of analysis. Here, you can build these instruments, these Bartik-style instruments, for any level of geography you like. So that's really convenient for us when we're working with school zones, which are kind of a non-standard, geographic unit. So that helps us a lot.
So, James, is your school zone of the same size?
No, they do. Yeah, they do differ a little bit, but not a huge amount. I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head. I think it's something like 10,000 people or something per school zone on average. And one thing, just to go back to, I think it was Maggie's question about rural versus suburban. Okay, so this is a school district with 700,000 students, so we're talking pretty big. So it's fairly dense, the city that we're talking about, and so these school zones are like not precisely, but are roughly evenly sized.
Right.
Yeah, but most of these zones they'll mostly have like one school each, basically. Yeah. So that was our raw data, just looking like that. Here's our regressions. Here is just our OLS regressions. So column 1, I'm just going to basically have no controls except for the year fixed effects. And in column 2, I'm going to start to add school zone fixed effects, demographic controls, and so on. A little bit of a change in the coefficient, but still positive and statistically significant. So saying that, you know, an increase in house prices is associated with an increase in local school quality. But now when we add our instrument, we actually get a bit of a jump, maybe a doubling in the size of the coefficient here. And we think probably reflecting mostly measurement error, but there's possibly also some endogeneity here too. The instrumental variables estimates are not really affected by the addition of controls or not. So we find that those estimates are fairly stable, regardless of the specification. The instrument is strong. The first stage F statistics over 200, so we're kind of happy with that. But yeah, these are our benchmark estimates. Now, the hard part is interpreting what this number means. The positive is good. The positive means that higher prices lead to higher quality. Okay, we're on board with that, but we need to know magnitude-wise, what does this mean? So we're just going to do a very simple back-of-the-envelope calculation following Chetty's work. So he found that a 1 unit increase in test scores is associated with a $50,000 increase in the present value of lifetime income for children. So given our estimates, this is our beta, and given, let's say, a standard deviation shock to house prices, which turns out to be about 65% over a 5-year period in this sample, and given the $50,000 estimate from Chetty, that tells us that there's about a $5,000 gain per year of schooling after one of these house price shocks occurs. So if children are in school for around 9 years, this is like their elementary school period. If they're in school for around 9 years, this is like a lifetime income gain of around $45,000 to $50,000. All fairly back of the envelope calculations, but the point is to show that these estimates tell us that this is a fairly sizable effect coming from house prices through school quality onto child's outcomes. So those are our headline results for the empirical work. I just want to say a couple quick things about what else we can do with this data. So we can say a bit. Oh, yes, sorry.
One question. So going back to the endogeneity issue where you're worried about the endogeneity of the shares. So, I mean, question, are these national share of characteristics, I guess that, and this is just a guess, but that most of the characteristic that matters is land, right? So how much land is the share, how big is the share of land in the overall house value? Because that's the one that moves around the most at the national level, right? The price of 1 bedroom versus 2 bedrooms, conditional and everything else probably doesn't move around very much, yeah?
Super good question. We actually found in our previous paper, the Graham et al. Paper from the AJ Macro this year, we actually found it was age that mattered the most. So land does matter. I'm not going to say it doesn't matter, but the one that mattered the most was changes in the valuation associated with age. The bedrooms and bathrooms don't matter very much, and actually we were a little bit concerned that there's some endogenous issues there, but age is fairly robust, and that's the one that drives most of the variation.
So the premium for new builds has a time variation in it, essentially.
Yeah, basically.
Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead.
Can you go to the table comparing OLS and IV?
Mm-hmm.
So comparing the coefficients for OLS and IV, it suggests that endogeneity attenuates the effect. And that means if you have a reverse causality from a school quality to housing prices, that effect seems to be negative according to this estimate.
Yeah, we've thought about this before. We think it might be more likely to be measurement error because that's the standard way of getting OLS to be biased downwards. It could still be a reverse causality story, but we couldn't think of an obvious one that would get you this negative bias. So if you have suggestions, we'd take them, but yeah, we weren't sure about that. So we think it might be measurement error.
But I guess, the difference between OLS and IV is not really about measurement error, but it is about the endogeneity, right? So when
measurement, if you have measurement error in your right-hand side variable here, the house prices, that's going to drag down the estimates of beta. But like you said, it could also be reverse causality. We can't really say which it would be.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I think you're right. The reverse causality story is it's hard to know what the shock would have to be to generate the downward bias. That's the part we kind of struggled with here. So if you can think of anything, let us know. But yeah, we weren't sure right off the top of our heads.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One thing about this Arctic shock
Mhm.
is there's no national housing market, right? So you're doing this at a national level.
Oh
but
yeah.
really
So,
things are local, right?
sure. Sorry, I should be a little bit more careful. I said national. We actually use the state level here for the aggregate shift for precisely the reason you're pointing out. So yeah.
And still, you know, housing market is a local market, right? So you're attributing changes at a state level to something that's local, which it may be quite different at the local level than
sure.
at the state level.
Yeah. No, that's right. So we're not yet. So that's right. So what that will tend to do though is it tends to mean the instrument is weaker than it could be. So like if for example I could find, I don't know, let's say local policy changes and use those as instruments, they should be a lot stronger because they're much stronger predictors of local price movements. Whereas this thing, I'm only able to capture the extent to which local prices co-move with more aggregated prices like state level prices. So yeah, they'll tend to make the instrument weaker than it should be. So if anything, it kind of works against us. But it seems to work. I mean, it seems to work pretty well. We get pretty strong first stages with these regressions. Cool. So yeah, just one quick thing here on mechanisms. So the other thing we can do with the data is kind of decompose value added into these different components. So the first decomposition we do is in columns 2 and 3. We split between peer value added, that's like the effect of your student body, and peer invariant value added, so that's the effect of the other things associated with the school, like the teachers, the physical buildings, the culture of the school, and so on. And so what we find there is both of them are moving positively with the effect of house prices, but more so the peer invariant component. So the peer invariant value added is very strongly moving, so that seems to be explaining most of this change in school value added. And we can do one step further. We can say amongst this peer invariant value added component, we can specifically look at teachers. The way we do this is we track teachers who are moving into and out of these schools, and we look at the quality of those teachers. And what we find is that there's this strong effect coming from this teacher quality channel. So this seems to be explaining a lot of the overall change in the school value added regressions. So we unfortunately can't do much more than that because this is really all the data we have on these teachers, but we think a lot of what's going on is teachers selecting into schools on the basis of socioeconomic status. So we have some robustness regression showing that socioeconomic status does change in response to these house price shocks. And we think based on these survey evidence that teachers are kind of following those socioeconomic changes. We think that's what's going on, but we can't really measure that directly, unfortunately. So I have about 13 minutes left. I'll see how much I can get through the quantitative model, but I do want to show you a couple of things. So in the quantitative model, then we're going to go back to our original question about these housing wealth effects. So we have evidence for our mechanism. We're going to have that in our model. It'll now be endogenous through an equilibrium mechanism, and we want to study what happens when we get these shocks that change the equilibrium, and then we see how households respond in terms of their housing wealth effects. So for the people that were asking about the details of the life cycle model, this is kind of an overview of what it looks like. We have households who are born, and really all they do is they're born and they get educated. That's it. There's no real choices here. At age 1, this sort of covers the young adulthood, if you like. These parents will earn income, consume, they'll save, although they can also borrow. That was a question too. So they can borrow against the value of their house, and they can choose a neighborhood to live in. At age 2, they'll again earn income, consume, and save, but now they've got the option to change neighborhoods if they would like. So they don't have to stay in that neighborhood. They could sell up and they can move if they want to. And at this stage, this is when they'll be educating their child, and when they'll if they want to, they can pass some transfers to their child as well. And then finally, we just have like a residual stage at age 3. You can sort of think of this as like pre-retirement or something. You still earn some income, maybe it's retirement income. You sell your house and you just consume everything. And the reason we have this stage is just so that you do have some, it'll be small, but some wealth effect from thinking about selling your house in the future, although you're not going to sell it necessarily at age 2. Then we have spatial equilibrium. So we have multiple neighborhoods, house prices have to clear those neighborhood markets, and then we have endogenous school quality, which we'll assume is driven by the income of the adult residents in these neighborhoods. Now, the reason we assume this is we're going to think, well, some of this was a peer effect. So some of it's about the parents of the children that live in these neighborhoods, but some of it's a teacher effect. And if teacher quality is kind of associated with their income in some way, then this will capture that, because we're going to take all the adults, both the age 1 with no children and the age 2 with children adults, and we'll input that into the school quality function. So I'll show you that briefly in a second or two. So I don't have heaps of time, so I won't go into all the details of the value functions and everything, but I'll just point out a couple of quick things. So the age 2 problem for the household is basically the same as the toy model we had, with some extra little features. So when you sell a house, you now face a transaction cost of selling the house, that kappa here, that will prevent you from wanting to move. So we'll be able to match the moving rates amongst households in the data. In our human capital function now, we still have the educational inputs and the school quality, but we also now have ability, which could be transmitted from parents to children. And finally, the child's income now is not just a one-off thing. We're going to think about the child's lifetime income here, and that's what enters the utility function for bequests. And then finally, these households can now borrow against the value of their house. This is just like a maximum loan-to-value ratio in this second to last equation down the bottom here. The school, the local choice function is the same as it was before. We'll now have 3 neighborhoods, and the only other addition is we'll include this common amenities value, ZN. So everyone values some neighborhoods more than others through like parks or hospitals or something like that. For the age 1 households, these households have received a bequest from their parent, B. They'll earn this income that came from the human capital they've already accumulated, and are buying a house for the first time, PN prime. Their income going into the next period will evolve with some shocks. So the log income is just a random walk. And their ability will get transmitted to their children imperfectly through this AR1 process. These households can also borrow against the value of their house, and that's what we get down the bottom here. So I won't say more about that. And the decision problem, the neighborhood decision problem is exactly the same, same common amenities, just an independent draw from the extreme value distribution. And finally, here's the spatial equilibrium. So the first condition just tells us what the housing market clearing condition has to be. On the right-hand side, this HN is the fixed housing supply for neighborhood N. And on the left-hand side, this is just total demand for housing. So we're just summing up the age 1 and age 2 residents, everyone that wants to live in neighborhood N. On the bottom, this is the school quality function. And the way we do this is sort of straight, it's basic, but it kind of helps us a little bit. We'll assume that school quality is just a basic function of the share of total income in neighborhood N. And the reason we do this is it keeps the school quality function bounded between 0 and 1. And that has some really nice properties for computing equilibrium, because it kind of reduces these agglomeration forces and stops us having like multiple equilibria and stuff like that. So this is going to help us there. There's a calibration, unless you're interested. It may be too much to go through at this point.
Sorry,
yes.
Hold up. Yeah, you have 3 areas. Yeah, you say.
Yep.
Stochastic process for prices.
No. Prices are equilibrium objects.
But they're not moving around. So they're.
They will. So for the steady state, they won't. For the steady state, they're fixed. But I'm going to do some dynamic experiments in a second that I'll show you.
Okay, so no one's expecting the prices to move around.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Everyone thinks they're in steady state forever.
Oh, okay, so that's okay.
Yeah. It's a good question though. But yeah, here's the neighborhoods. We're fixing them to be 50% of the population, 30% of the population, and 20% of the population. And then we sort of rank the prices in these neighborhoods. So the bottom neighborhood's like a low price neighborhood, then a middle price neighborhood, and then a high price neighborhood. And in the calibration, we're actually going to target these prices relative to what we see in the data. So we take all the school zones in our school district, we line up all of their house prices, we cut those prices at the 50th percentile and the 80th percentile, and then we just compute the average price within each of those groups. And so we can match in the calibration those relative prices across these grouped neighborhoods. We can also match the relative incomes across those neighborhoods. We take that data from the ACS and we do a pretty good job of matching that as well. And there's other statistics we worry about, like, inequality, intergenerational mobility, and so on, all taken from Chetty data. So I can talk about that if anyone's interested. And here, to go back to, I think it was Jonathan's question, here's the experiment where the shocks start to come in. So everything I did up to now was a steady state equilibrium. So as we just said, the households don't expect prices to move. They just think that they're going to live there forever. But now what we do is we hit the model with an unexpected set of shocks. So they don't expect this to happen, but suddenly there'll be a permanent shock to the common amenity value of a neighborhood ZN. So now, all of a sudden, your neighborhood is more valuable. There's a park or a hospital or something that makes you want to live there. And we're going to choose the size of this amenity shock to generate a 10% permanent increase in house prices. Then what we have to, so that gets us a new steady state. And now what we have to do is solve the transition path between those steady states. David, did you have a question?
You have 5 minutes.
5 minutes, yeah, okay, cool. So we have to compute these transition paths between the new steady states. And this is where the difficulty comes in, because if you've played with these before, you probably know that there can be multiple equilibria. It can be difficult to find them and eliminate them. And that's what we're kind of grappling with at the moment, but we do have some results to show you. And so what's involved here is solving for a whole transition path of prices for every neighborhood and school qualities for every neighborhood. And then what we do with these experiments is we then study the response of these age 2 households who already chose where to live, but now suddenly they find themselves with an increase or a decrease in their house value, and they have to decide what to do with it. So we then can look at their standard housing wealth effects, how much do they want to consume, how much do they want to transfer, and the intergenerational wealth effects. So roughly, these are what the experiments look like. A shock to amenities in one of the neighborhoods, and then the prices go up or down, qualities go up or down. We're going to take all 3 of these experiments and stack them and use all of the data. We can rerun the regression that we did in the data, and we get kind of similar results, suggesting that the model's generating a same kind of mechanism that we see in the data. But I won't talk too much about this because this is our main result here. So taking all of that data and looking at the households responding to these house price shocks and the changes, the endogenous changes in school quality, what do they do with all of this now? So what do? Well, first, in the first column, they increase their consumption. And the marginal propensity to consume out of these house price shocks is actually pretty similar to what we've seen in empirical work, Mian and Sufi and others. So it's about 4.5% is how much they're consuming out of that house price shock. These households also transfer some of this wealth to their children. It's not a huge amount, but they do send some extra transfers to their children, and that corroborates what's in some of these new empirical papers about these intergenerational housing wealth effects, focused entirely on transfers. There's some small change in educational spending, but there's also this 1.8% increase in lifetime present value of child income. So children are benefiting from this equilibrium change in house prices and school quality. And the reason is exactly as we've already explored, because local school quality is rising, these kids take advantage of that, and they get higher incomes in the future as a result. So we can see that by decomposing stuff into the partial equilibrium effects. So the first row here is if we only shock things with just the amenity shocks, basically no change really in anything except willingness to move. If we look at the changes in prices on their own, we get large consumption effects, moderate-sized transfer effects, but basically no child income effect. So like we had in the toy model, the price effects don't spill over to child income. But if we look at the qualities on their own, the changes in school quality on their own, basically all of that effect loads up on child income. So what's kind of interesting here is that the house price effects get us the standard housing wealth effects channel, whereas the school quality effects are giving us this new intergenerational inequality channel. We can also look at like movers versus stayers and so on, but I don't really have much more time to go into that. And then the final thing we do in the model, I won't give you details, but this is what we do, is we want to try and understand what transmission channels are trying to account for these changes. So we do some stuff with the steady state of the model. The main thing I want you to focus on is up the top here and the bottom here, so panels A and B and then D and E. So the top one's looking at income transitions from parents to children. And the main thing we find is that across neighborhoods, there's this downward gradient. The higher priced your neighborhood is, the less likely you are to get stuck at the bottom of the income distribution, and the more likely you are to move to the top of the income distribution. But in red, what we're showing is when you shut down the school quality channel, this just equalizes everything basically. And so what you find is that there's no longer these strong intergenerational income effects. Down the bottom, we find something similar for wealth, except here, everything comes through transfers. So the main kind of story here is when we think back to those intergenerational wealth effects, what we're finding is that they're propagated through the school quality channel when it comes to income, and through this transfers channel when it comes to just the pure like wealth itself. So there's more of that to be fleshed out, but that's kind of where we're going with this, and I'll just conclude with the last 15 seconds. So what we did here is we studied intergenerational wealth effects of local house price movements, focusing a lot on this school quality channel. So households, when they're thinking about the value of their house, have to decide, do they want to eat more of the equity that they're gaining here, or do they want to stick around to then give this benefit to their children by having their children enjoy the higher school quality that they see? We provided some empirical analysis that suggests that this mechanism is there in the data, so higher house prices look like they're associated with higher school quality. And then finally, we built all of this into a quantitative model to try and understand these housing wealth effects, and we're trying to flesh out more about what this implies for this inequality and intergenerational mobility. That'll be our next few things to do in this paper. So thanks all for listening, and I'm happy to take other questions or suggestions.
Right. Okay. Thanks, James. Any question or comments on the floor? I think Luis.
Yeah,
Luis?
can you guys hear me?
Yep.
So yeah, great paper, very interesting, and I think that the model is very useful to describe the kind of trade-offs that you find empirically. I was wondering if you have thought of private education and what role it would play, right? Because in a way, if you are consuming some of your wealth now, you could be consuming it for private consumption, or you could be consuming it to give to your kids in the form of private education.
Yeah, good question. So we haven't done a lot on this. One thing, my co-author Mike Gilrain is like an education expert, so he tells me that at the elementary or public school level, private education in this particular state is not large. It's a small fraction. Apparently, that's much more common at the secondary school level. So to the extent we're just focusing on elementary school, we've kind of not ruled it out, but we think it's less important. But it's probably much more. I think it's probably much more important once you get to secondary school level, and obviously beyond. If we're thinking about college decisions and so on, definitely, funds to pay for colleges, private or public, are obviously a big deal. But yeah, we haven't done a lot with that at this stage. The only other thing I'll say is my other co-author Angela has some papers thinking about charter schools, and that also kind of comes in here too. It's not exactly private, but I mean it's related. And what she finds is that charter schools tend to dampen some of these forces. So if you introduce a charter school in a neighborhood that had like high prices and high school quality, it tends to dampen the price of that neighborhood because people are being sucked away to go to the charter school instead.
And that
so it
detaches your decision of location with the
education
decision in both cases.
Exactly.
I've seen evidence that the availability of both charter and private is very different across space. So maybe it would be interesting to look at places where this is more available versus others where it is.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. It's a super interesting question. I sort of am reluctant to add more to this paper, but I do want to do that at some point in the future. And I actually think if anyone's interested in this, Australia is a really good test case for this because the private school going rate is close to 40% across Australia. So there's a really high fraction of students that are opting out of the public system to go private. So I think this would be a good place to kind of test that kind of idea of whether this, breaks that kind of like link between your location decision and your education decision. So yeah, super good question. A really interesting idea.
You raise your hand. We'd like to unmute and
Yes, thank you for the interesting paper. I just want to understand a bit better about, is it a school catchment area? Because my understanding, if the kids go to the secondary school, they need to be selected. So in the case, like in UK market, sorry, I'm based in UK, so I'm not about the US. So in UK, you can select the school, but you live somewhere else. if you are rich enough, right? So you don't really need to live the neighborhoods have better school quality, but you can just live it somewhere nicer, amenities better, or it's more high class. Then you get the school, get the kids to a private school somewhere else, have better quality in teaching or school like teacher quality. So I just want to understand the mechanism between the house price and then school quality you are mentioning.
Yeah. So yeah, super good question. So here for like primary schools or elementary schools, this is all a catchment area based system. So you for public schools, you basically have to go to the public school in the area that you're in, the catchment area that you're in. Once you get to high school, though, you're exactly right. There's more choice. So there's more likely to be charter schools at the high school level. There's more likely to be special schools. More private schooling exists at that level, and there's more options to like move across the city and go to other kinds of schools as well. So that kind of stuff starts to break the link between location and school the higher up you go. But at the primary school level, you're really tied to the public school in your school zone or your catchment area, and that's what. But the data, that's exactly what we're focusing on, is just this just these primary school districts. Yeah.
Rob.
Sorry, I'm skimming.
I think Rob Wisma.
Hi, James. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Rob Lossmer, coming to you from Sacramento, California. I suspect your school district might be a bit south of me. Why the need for the secrecy? Why can't we know what the school district is?
Yeah, sure. Because the data provider has some weird thing about like they're worried that somehow you will like reverse engineer like the individual students or something, and so they don't like want to be named. I don't know. It's my co-author has the data contract, and they're like very strict about this. It's super weird, but it's weird because I can tell you all of these facts, which make it super obvious what school district this is. Like super obvious. I just can't say it out loud.
Yeah. I just sent you an email requesting if you had a working paper or willing to share the PowerPoint.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I'd appreciate it. Maybe others would also.
Yeah.
Thanks for very informative and stimulating.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Rob. Just to add to that, if anyone's not able to guess as well as Rob is, it might help you to know that this is also a fairly low home ownership district, and it's a fairly high Hispanic area district as well, if that helps pin it down more.
James, just curious whether you are able to find any district where house price increase but school quality has not changed, and how this will affect the student quality.
That's a good question. I mean, there will be individuals, right? Like all of this stuff has variation. So here there's individual variation. You'll definitely see some places where things go like in the opposite direction as well. So occasionally school quality will go up, and yet the prices have gone down. There's some, we haven't looked into like specific examples of this, but there's some weird stuff that happens during the recession. So if you look at like 2009, 2010, obviously prices are going down everywhere. And so you can get locations that have had big drops in prices, but they're like good locations. And so the quality is actually going up relative to other locations. So you can get some strange stuff like that. We haven't focused on it here, but you for sure you could go looking for that if you wanted to do case studies or something.
So
I was just thinking whether go ahead. Sorry,
and just building on what I think a comment you just made, like, are you a bit worried that some reduced form elements of your model, like the connection between school quality and house prices, might have something to do with the homeownership rate in the area?
Yeah, I mean, it could do, because home ownership is about 50%, which is like lower than the national average. So, I mean, it could do. Maybe there's some like, I don't know, investors are making a big difference here.
No, just that. I mean, if house prices go up, presumably rents also go up. And
right. Right.
And so
that would be okay for us.
If everyone were renting, that would have a very different implication.
Oh, yes. Sorry. No, now I see what you're saying. Yeah, no, absolutely right. The wealth effect goes out the window then, because renters don't own. So, like, if the value of the house goes up, they don't care. Like, other than to the extent rents go up, they just don't care about housing equity at all. So, yeah, if we were to also build renters into this, then you'd have some guys that have no wealth effect whatsoever because they're just renters, and then you have owners that get all the direct wealth effects. In principle, we could have a model that has both. And you could say, look, it's just like I don't know, maybe it's not a choice. It's just like some people are allocated owners and some people are not. It would just be a lot harder to solve. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, you should really have renters in here too, because the data has renters. and a lot of them for this district, but yeah, just for simplicity, we kept it out of the model. Yeah, but it's a good question.
Okay, any more questions from the audience? If not, I think I would like to thanks again, James, for a very interesting paper. And hope before we close the session, David, you would like to announce for the next seminar?
Sure. So our next speaker will be Camilo Acosta. He will be presenting on the quality of communications infrastructure, local structural transformation, and inequality. That will be in 2 weeks, and I sure hope to see you all there. And thanks again to James for an excellent presentation. I think we're all going to quite interesting. And especially thanks to him for presenting at 2 a.m. or whatever it is.
Yeah, now we're approaching 3 a.m. So
Sorry.
But yeah, no, thank you all, and thanks for having me. This is really great. So yeah, hope you guys have a good continuing seminar series.
Okay, thank you very much for all your participation. See you again.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.